The Chinese-Soviet border conflict of 1969 marked a significant deterioration in relations between two major communist powers, China and the Soviet Union. This article provides an overview of the Chinese-Soviet border conflict, its causes, key events, and its impact on the global geopolitical landscape during the Cold War era. Background and ideological differences. China and the Soviet Union were both socialist states and members of the Communist bloc. However, ideological differences and conflicting national interests strained their relationship. China's leader, Mao Zedong, criticized Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's policies and advocated for a more revolutionary and independent path for communism. Causes and border dispute. The Chinese-Soviet border conflict had multiple causes. Border dispute. The conflict arose from long-standing border disputes between China and the Soviet Union. These disputes centered around territorial claims in areas such as the eastern portion of the Soviet Union's Xinjiang region and the Chinese province of Sinkai. Ideological differences. The ideological divide between China and the Soviet Union, particularly in relation to the interpretation of Marxism-Leninism and the direction of the global communist movement, exacerbated tensions and added a political dimension to the conflict. Key events and escalation. The Chinese-Soviet border conflict witnessed several significant events. Border clashes. In March 1969, clashes erupted along the disputed Sino-Soviet border. Chinese and Soviet troops engaged in armed skirmishes, resulting in casualties on both sides. Military buildup. Both China and the Soviet Union rapidly deployed troops, artillery, and military assets to the border region. The conflict escalated as both sides reinforced their positions and engaged in limited military engagements. Failed negotiations. Attempts at diplomatic negotiations to resolve the conflict proved unsuccessful, with both sides unwilling to compromise on their territorial claims. The escalation and ceasefire. By late 1969, the intensity of the conflict began to subside. The two sides declared a ceasefire and gradually disengaged their forces from the border areas. Impact and aftermath. The Chinese-Soviet border conflict had profound implications. Fracture in communist unity. The conflict shattered the illusion of a unified communist bloc. It exposed the deep divisions and ideological differences between China and the Soviet Union, leading to a split within the global communist movement. Realignment of international relations. The conflict had repercussions on the global geopolitical landscape during the Cold War. China sought closer relations with the United States as a counterbalance to the Soviet Union, while the Soviet Union formed strategic alliances with other communist nations. Shift in China's foreign policy. The border conflict led China to adopt a more independent and assertive foreign policy. China distanced itself from the Soviet Union and pursued its own path in global affairs, focusing on promoting its own interests and revolutionary ideology. Legacy of mistrust. The conflict left a legacy of mistrust and strained relations between China and the Soviet Union that lasted for years. It took several decades for the two nations to normalize their relations and find common ground. Conclusion. The Chinese-Soviet border conflict of 1969 represented a significant fracture within the communist world and strained relations between China and the Soviet Union. The conflict revealed underlying ideological differences, territorial disputes, and power struggles. It altered the dynamics of the Cold War and left a lasting impact on global politics, contributing to a reconfiguration of alliances and a recalibration of China's foreign policy.